teacher is explaining to the class that everybody sins except Jesus and Mary. And with that, some kid says, wait a minute, that's not true. Jesus sinned. And the teacher goes, Jesus sinned? Yeah, he said, yesterday at church we heard that Jesus had a temple tantrum. Think about it. But that really is something to think about. How do we understand what we just heard? I mean, there's no doubt that Jesus is almost out of control. I mean, overturning tables and driving out animals and all that. So how do we understand that from a man who also said, but I say to you, whoever is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment? So first, I want to share with you a couple reflections on anger just in and of itself. First of all, anger, while strongly expressed, may not necessarily be the same thing as aggression. Anger can be an expression of legitimate expectations that have not been realized. Secondly, anger can have two effects on us. Sometimes we get so angry that we get frozen. And then sometimes anger can motivate us. Thirdly, St. Augustine had an insight. He said, hope has two daughters, anger and courage. Anger that what should not be is, and that what is should not be. And courage to move out from the false sense of security of the upper room, determined that what should be will be, and what should not be will not be. Hope has two daughters, anger and courage. And finally, maybe in light of Augustine's reflection, it's true that a lot of times we're just simply angry at ourselves. And that anger of expectations not yet realized can be the beginning of conversion. In other words, an expression of hope. So let's take a look then in all those contexts about anger at today's gospel. Jesus' anger arises out of zeal for his Father's house because people no longer treated the temple as a holy place. And he knows that even less will they treat his body as the holy temple that is really the most important. So Jesus is angry that buildings are treated with more dignity than the living temples of the Holy Spirit. Which, if you stop to think about it, has to do with one of the covenant promises, or the 10 Commandments, if you will, that we heard in today's first reading. You shall not kill. Because that has to do, in part, with not recognizing the holiness of the human person as a temple of God. So it is always important to recognize that when Jesus says he knows human nature, he knows that so often we look to do just the minimum. And when it comes to these covenant promises or commandments, doing the minimum means just stopping to say, well, I haven't broken it. But what Jesus says is that he has come not just to abolish, or not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. In other words, Jesus lifts up the value and says, it's not enough just to say, have I violated the value, but have I done all that I can to put that value into practice? So how do we respect all human life as temples of God? And so now I share with you a few reflections based on the Church's official teaching. First of all, life begins at conception. Clearly, abortion is a crime against this truth, and that we might very well have just anger that our society still promotes abortion. But there are other things as well. The Church clearly teaches that the death penalty is morally wrong. And another word that we just heard, if you paid attention to the news last week, is collateral damage. So a strike was ordered on a place in Syria, and a number of people died. Now, it is true that President Biden decided not to do another strike because he was told that there, for sure, there would be innocent women and children. But collateral damage, that idea that, it's just part of making war, has to send a chill down our moral spines. And then there is this fulfillment piece. For instance, there's an ongoing debate about health care. Is health care a right for all people or a privilege for those who can afford it? The Church has been clearly stating for a number of decades that health care is a basic human right and therefore a pro-life issue. It's fine to debate the best way to provide health care for everyone. It is not okay to debate whether health care should be available to everyone. Now, it's true that in a homily you can't really go into depth with things like all these issues around the you shall not kill, both its avoidance of breaking it and how do you fulfill it. But in the context of today's gospel, let me leave you with a few questions. First, what causes you to be angry? Only things that affect you and your family? Have you ever felt anger when seeing a starving child in the news? Or do you do everything possible to avoid seeing starving children so that you don't have anger? Or is it a sin that more money is spent in our country on diet aids than on feeding hungry children in poor nations? And if that is a sin, whose sin is it? Does it move you to work for justice? Last week, in the Transfiguration, Peter said, "It is good for us to be here." It is good for us to be here, even when what we hear causes us to be uncomfortable.